Imagine a vast, rolling countryside in northern France. Summer of 1916. The air is thick, not with the scent of wildflowers, but with anticipation and the distant, metallic temps of war. This was supposed to be the moment, the decisive push, the big push, that would finally break the grueling stalemate of World War. Aye, this was the Battle of the Somme, but what was intended as a glorious victory march would instead descend into one of the most horrific chapters in human history, a symbol of industrial-scale slaughter that would scar the psyche of nations. Today, we re-stepping back into the mud-soaked trenches of the Western Front to understand why the Somme became a name synonymous with futility and unimaginable loss. How did a meticulously planned offensive, backed by the might of the British and French empires, go so catastrophically wrong? By mid-1916, the war had been raging for nearly 2 years. The initial hopes of a quick conflict had long since dissolved into the grim reality of trench warfare. Millions were locked in a deadly embrace across a jagged line of fortified earth stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The French army was bleeding dry at the Battle of Verdun, a relentless meat grinder initiated by the Germans. The Allies desperately needed to relieve the pressure on Verdun and achieve a breakthrough. The Somme offensive was their answer. The plan, primarily conceived by British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig, was ambitious. It was a strategy built on brute force and overwhelming firepower. For 7 straight days leading up to the attack, a relentless artillery barrage would pound the German lines. Over 1.5 million shells were fired, with the goal of obliterating the German barbed wire, destroying their trenches and machine gun nests, and crushing the morale of the defenders. The British commanders were confident. So confident, in fact, that they believed their infantry would simply be able to walk across no man's land and occupy the shattered German positions. The soldiers, many of them volunteers from what were known as PALS battalions, men who had enlisted together from the same towns, factories, and offices, were told the German wire would be gone. They were told they would face little to no resistance. As dawn broke on July 1, 1916, whistles blew along miles of British trenches. Burdened with nearly 60 pounds of equipment, these men climbed over the top and advanced at a walking pace, shoulder to shoulder, into the morning mist. But a fatal miscalculation had been made. The preliminary bombardment had been a devastating failure. A significant number of the shells were duds, and those that did explode were often the wrong type to effectively cut the thick, deeply entangled German barbed wire. More critically, the German army had constructed deep, concrete tree-enforced dugouts, some as far as 40 feet underground. They had weathered the storm of steel in relative safety. As the bombardment lifted, and the British troops began their slow, methodical advance across the shell-cratered expanse of no man's land, the German soldiers emerged from their subterranean shelters. They set up their machine guns, the deadly Maxim MG08s, on the parapets of their largely intact trenches, and prepared to meet the oncoming waves of men. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The advancing British soldiers, marching in neat lines across open ground, were mown down in their thousands. The German machine gunners, many of them horrified by the slaughter unfolding before them, described how they didn't even have to aim. They just traversed their guns back and forth across the packed ranks of Allied troops. Entire battalions were wiped out in minutes. The Newfoundland Regiment, for example, suffered a staggering 90% casualty rate in under half an hour. By the end of that first day, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties, including over 19,000 killed. It remains the single bloodiest day in the history of the British military. The Great Offensive had gained virtually no ground, at an almost unbelievable cost. The optimism of the morning had evaporated, replaced by shock, horror, and a profound sense of betrayal among the surviving troops. Yet, the battle did not stop. For the commanders, there was no turning back. The battle had to continue, both to relieve the French at Verdun, and because the sheer scale of the investment in men and material made retreat seem unthinkable. The Somme devolved from a single, decisive push into a grinding war of attrition that would last for another 4.5 months, until winter finally brought the fighting to a halt. The landscape was transformed into a nightmarish, lunar-like wasteland of mud, shell craters, and corpses. Both sides threw more and more men into the meat grinder. The initial goals of a breakthrough were replaced by the grim arithmetic of attrition, to kill more of the enemy than they killed of you. Amidst this hellscape, the nature of warfare itself was evolving. On September 15th, a new and terrifying machine rumbled onto the battlefield at Flers-Courcelette. It was the first ever deployment of the tank. These early models, known as the Mark I, were slow, clumsy, and prone to mechanical failure. Of the 49 tanks available, only a handful made it into action. But their psychological impact was immense. German soldiers, who had never seen anything like these armored beasts, fled in terror. Though their initial impact was limited, the tanks offered a glimpse into the future of mechanized warfare and a potential way to break the deadlock of the trenches. By the time the battle officially ended in mid-November 1916, the front line had moved a mere 6 miles. The cost for this tiny strip of ravaged earth was astronomical. In total, the British, French, and German armies suffered a combined total of over 1.5 million casualties. An entire generation was decimated. The PALS battalions were a particularly tragic case, as the immense losses meant that entire communities back home lost almost all of their young men in a single stroke. The Battle of the Somme left a deep and lasting scar. For the soldiers who survived, it was a source of lifelong trauma. For the nations involved, especially Britain, it became a potent symbol of the senseless slaughter of the Great War. It shattered the romantic notions of warfare and eroded public trust in military and political leadership. The name Somme entered the language as a byword for pointless sacrifice and horrific loss, but it wasn't entirely without strategic consequence. The relentless pressure did force the Germans to divert troops from Verdun, arguably saving the French from collapse. It also inflicted irreplaceable losses on the highly trained German army, forcing them onto the defensive on the Western Front for the next year. The experience gained, however brutal, also led to significant tactical innovations in the British Army, improving their use of artillery, infantry, and the new tank weapon, which would pay dividends in later battles. Still, when we look back at the Somme, it's the human cost that resonates most powerfully. It stands as a terrifying monument to the horrors of industrial warfare and a stark reminder of the catastrophic failure of leadership that sent hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths for a few miles of mud. The fields of the Somme are quiet now, dotted with serene military cemeteries, where rows upon rows of white headstones stand in silent testimony to the price that was paid. They remind us not of glory, but of the profound tragedy of war and the lost generation that was sacrificed there. The story of the Somme is not just a page in a history book. It's a vital lesson about the real cost of conflict. If you're passionate about uncovering these crucial moments from our past, we invite you to be part of our channel. We're a community of history enthusiasts looking for volunteers to help with research and content creation. If you'd like to join us, please check our About page for details on how you can get involved. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell to continue exploring the pivotal moments that have shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.